After the sitting last week, Chad asked me if I had heard of this new book, relatively new book, called Why Buddhism Is True. Have any of you heard of that? Chad, okay, good. I had heard of it, seen it advertised a number of times, so, I thought it would, I happened to find myself at the Rubin Museum in Chelsea. If you're familiar with that, I'm a member there. It's a wonderful place. On Sunday, and there in the bookshop, there it was. So I read it, at least a lot of it, and I'll give you some highlights and commentary, and then you can see for yourself. It's by someone who is he's taught in the psychology department, so he's a psychologist, a scientist first of all, then in the religion department at Princeton, and currently it says he's visiting professor of science and religion at UTS, Union Theological, up where I live. And he's a very good writer. If he kind of puts himself up as an extreme case, kind of like St. Paul on Christianity, I'm an extreme case, so listen to me. He says, I'm not really made for meditation, and I was skeptical about it, and so if you are too, well, come along with me for the ride. And it's very readable, very, very humorous also in his style, very accessible. So if you're a little puzzled by some of these esoteric concepts of Buddhism, and you're wondering about what meditation is all about and how it's supposed to work, read it. You'll be in good company. Now, he says at the very beginning, a note to readers, what does he mean, true? Why Buddhism is true? What is he claiming? Well, he says, I'm not talking about the supernatural aspects of Buddhism, like you find also very much in Tibetan, and, even reincarnation, he's not talking about that at all. It's just about the phenomenon of life and meditation as we can do it. He realizes there's not just one Buddhism. He's more into the Vipassana in his own meditation. He is a practitioner and continues to be, so he's trustworthy in that respect. And he's not going into this, the arcana, as I sometimes do, like the Sarangama Sutra that we've talked about, into the fine points of Buddhist psychology or philosophy. He says one Pitaka says that there are 89 kinds of consciousness. You may be relieved to hear that this book will spend no time trying to evaluate that claim. So that's the kind of thing. And true, he says it's a tricky word, so he says he's taking kind of the way the Buddhists tend to take it, as we more of us should take it, does this work? Does this actually illuminate life? Never mind, some kind of abstract conceptual claim for truth with a capital T. He's not talking about that, and nor is Buddhism for the most part. And he's not making any claims about other spiritual traditions, better or worse. He quotes the Dalai Lama as saying, don't try to use what you learn from Buddhism to be a better Buddhist, but use it to be a better whatever you are already. As you know, that's what the Dalai Lama says. So the first chapter says taking the red pill. How many of you know the Matrix, Keanu Reeves? So from 1999, you could take the red pill or the blue pill, and the blue pill was to stay in your dream state, where robots were, or whoever was controlling you and giving you a dream world to live in. You can stay there in your illusion if you want. Or you can take the red pill, which will take you out of that. So he says Buddhism is taking the red pill. Because we are all in this delusional world, living under the blue pill. And meditation can help you see more clearly. Wake up, in other words, as the Buddha says. Now, it seems to me that by the way, his name is Robert Wright. And it seems to me his most original contribution here is to see the human condition as Buddhism understands it in terms of evolutionary psychology and evolution in general. So in an appendix, it goes through some of the Buddhist truths, quotation marks. And he says, the fact that things are dukkha, that they're not insufferable exactly, that they're suffering, that they're unsatisfactory, that we're always striving for something, that we want something that we don't have, and we don't want something that we do have. He says natural selection did that to us. So blame that. You know, that's what created us to want more and not want something that we don't have, and not want something that we do have, because we want our own little being to be flourishing. We always want more. We want to grow, and we want to get rid of anything that's. We want, in other words, he keeps saying, for our genes to be communicated, you know, to the next generation. That's what evolution has made us for. So all these things that the Buddha talks about are built into the way we've come through in our evolution. But it's not exactly a recipe for lifelong happiness, he says. But that's what happens because of our evolutionary psychology. And he says, you know, it's also built in, if you think about it. He says that the pleasure we get is supposed to only last a moment to get what we want right now, but it can't last, because then we're supposed to be going on to something else. So even that is built into it, and it's part of, you know, the dukkha, the unsatisfactoriness that we experience. You know, and in general, he says, you know, the illusion that we're given built into us by evolution is that I have to pass on my genes, whatever it takes, in my family, in my tribe, and that's it, you know. Never mind the illusion that my genes are more important than somebody else's, of all the other 7 billion people in the world. Really? I mean, you might be a little prettier or a little smarter or a little, but you're not really that much better than anybody else, so why should your genes? So that is a basic delusion, but it's built in. I mean, it's actually built in so that we can fight to have our own genes, you know, the natural selection and evolution and Darwin and all that stuff. But that's going to cause problems sooner or later. Now, this is very interesting because quite a few years ago there was an article in American Magazine, a Christian Jesuit publication, about what original sin could perhaps in our own time best be understood as. And that's what they said. All these evolutionary passions and stuff, you know, the impulses that are built into us, that works very well for a while, for, you know, millions of years, to get us to where we are, to get life to reach where it is, it's not really working anymore when you get to a more spiritual level, to a more advanced stage of evolution. And he does go on to talk about that, as you'll see in a minute, right here. But I think that's a very good way of looking at it. All the contradictions and conflicts of duality and of being separate, or thinking we're separate, or acting as though we're separate, my genes instead of yours, are what cause us to get where we are. But then we have to go beyond it, because if we stay on that level, we'll kill each other, which is what we're doing, as he points out. So he does go into a discussion of that. So this ourself is not who we think we are. He speaks. Has a couple of chapters on no self. He has a chapter called "The CEO is MIA." In other words, the supposedly controlling self or ego that we have is actually MIA. It doesn't even really exist. And he says this is some experimental psychology that speaks of a modular mind. It even supports that. You can read up on that in the chapter. But he's speaking about the no self. What does that actually mean? And he goes through the 5 skandhas of the Heart Sutra. You know, form, sensation, conception or perception, judgment, conception, discrimination, judgment, and then ultimately awareness, consciousness. And even that, in Buddhism, this low level of consciousness is a skandha. That is to say, it's just a heap. It's just something that is piled together and it has no real substance to it. Reminds me a little bit of the medieval distinctions, the scholastic distinctions about particular reason or common sense, which is just kind of collating things at data at a certain level, like a computer. And that's really not very substantial. There's no substrate what a self would be under that. And we do discover that. He says, now if you go further in your meditation, you some speak about a kind of a witness consciousness. You come across this in a number of spiritual writers. So you're kind of just looking at all this stuff going on, and there is something behind it. Ken Wilber speaks about that, witness consciousness. And he mentions that. So there is consciousness beyond, but I think, and as you'll see the 89 levels of consciousness that we just heard, there are really deeper levels of, well, what is it? It's not the self in that false self, ego self, limited self, separate self, self-asserting self that we know. So, but there is something. There does seem to be something there, and he has an interesting reflection on that. What is there, and emptiness, oneness, and what's the difference? What's emptiness and oneness, and what is it? What is it? What are we talking about? And he said, he says that in the Hindu tradition, you speak about a self which is the universal self, the Atman, which is the Brahman. Whereas in Buddhism, you specifically, and he goes into this, you specifically deny that kind of thing because it tends to reify something or maybe limit it by talking about it. And this reminds me of a discussion I had in one of my many interface meetings. We had a group of about 10 people that got together fairly regularly under the Global Peace Initiative of Women's Contemplative Alliance. And it was looking back, a little disappointing that everyone was very much and fervently into their own thing, which is good, otherwise you can't really meet anybody else, you don't have anything to share, you don't have anything that you're enthusiastic about. But there really wasn't a lot of interest in really getting into someone else's thing. So I remember one meeting where there was a Zen practitioner from Croatia and an American Vedanta Swami. And they finally, were talking about this issue. No self or absolute self. And finally, as you would expect, the Swami said, well, look, there really isn't a conflict here. We're just talking about it in a slightly different way. We're talking about a vastness, which is, bigger than any kind of little self that we could ever imagine. So what's the problem? And that's what he says here. And I completely agree with that. That there is, well, what? It's empty in the sense that it's not limited. All our mental apparatus aren't what we're talking about, and you can't define it, you can't confine it, and so it's empty of all determinations. But it's huge. I mean, you can't have to experience it, for yourself. That kind of oneness with everything. Oneness, with everything, and he brings in how it's partly the codependent arising, the dependent co-arising. Everything is not substantial, but everything is interconnected. So there's a kind of a oneness there. There's a wholeness there, where everything is brought together, and that's the basis of real enlightened behavior, when you realize you are everything, you're one with everything. He quotes Judson Brewer here, who a good friend of mine, who in fact I married him and his wife some years ago. He's a neuroscientist in Insight Meditation Center in Brown now, actually, is where it is now. And did experiments with him on, meditation, the neuroscience of meditation. But he says, and he's a meditator himself. He answered. He was asked, if everyone in the world meditated, would there be any wars? And he answered with a question: why would someone want to harm themselves? In that sense, I don't think there would be, because it's like, why would you cut off your right hand? You're not separate from anybody. So if you harm anybody, you harm yourself. I mean, it just follows. It's just what you experience. It's like the mystical body of Christ, and we're all members of one body, or the one vine, to use Jesus' imagery. Or today's Page-a-Day Zen calendar, which quoted a master saying that the true self is brilliantly transcendent, and like the deep blue color of the sky, there's no gap between it and anything else. You must be quoting Dogen, the Dogen quote that I always use, that the true self, the true person is not any individual in particular, but like the deep blue color of the limitless sky, everyone, everywhere in the world. So if you're empty, there's no self, and it's beyond the ego, you're actually discover that you're everybody, and then how do you behave? So that's the next stage of evolution, really. If everyone is one thing, why should I do something, if there was an I there to do it, to perturb this? Why should I do something bad to you? Because you're not you, and I'm not me. I'm you, and you're me. Whatever that means. The little empty self, the little self there is empty. So in very practical terms, the next section is, the time I didn't kill a man who was snoring. So why would you kill a man who was snoring when you're just killing yourself? It reminds me of the time I had my breakthrough sesshin in 2002, and I was in a house with, kind of like a dorm situation, and there was one guy who wanted this fan on at a certain speed or whatever, and I just let it go. It wasn't what I wanted, but who cares? I mean, who cares? It's not important. So you don't pick and choose, you don't pick and choose. Now he has at the very end a 4-page footnote on, Joshu's thing about picking and choosing. He doesn't quote Joshu by name, but if you're supposed to not want anything or resist anything, then why should you even want what's positive then? Why should love and joy and peace be something you should choose? Isn't that choosing something in particular instead of being completely open to whatever? He says that's more of a theoretical problem, but it is a problem. I came up actually with someone in spiritual direction with me very recently, the same kind of issue. What about in prayer when you have this positive feeling? Should you let go of that too? It's an important thing on the cushion. Well, if it's some particular feeling that you are having, or some particular choice you want, well, maybe you let go. But ultimately, joy, peace, and love are not. It's not a feeling that you have. It's what you are. It's what the universe is. It's reality itself. So it's not a feeling you have. It's you. It's it. It's the whole thing. I think that's really, really important to realize. That is the actual energy of the universe at its deepest level. Is love and joy. That's what being is. All you have to do is experience it. And and he does speak about that. So he says, if you speak about evolution, is delusional when it says, my genes are more important than others, but it also says life is good and worth preserving and worth promoting, which we can hold on to that. But we just have to understand it and live it on a deeper, broader level. That's all. So we don't want to reject what is also in a sense the value of natural selection, that the creation and sustenance of sentient life is good. Happily, mindfulness meditation is well suited to fighting the first value, the specialness of myself, while serving the second one. And it brings us closer to the truth as a bonus. And this is good. You could even view mindfulness meditation itself as in some sense a part of the natural unfolding of life. This is something Beatrice Boutreau is very strong on too, as I was talking a few weeks ago. So this is actually part of the actual flow of evolution. You don't have to get rid of evolution and start a different thing. This is the actual evolution of evolution. That's what we're discovering here. Maybe the only way for complex consciousness to arise on this planet was for it to be warped in the process, distorted by the exaltation of self. And maybe once social organization approaches the global level, the only way for complex consciousness to flourish on this planet, or even to survive, is for it now to be unwarped, or at least to be partly unwarped, he says. And that's what meditation is for. That's what this waking up is for, to realize how we can really grow. So natural selection has equipped us with the tools for addressing the problem, the rational and reflective faculties that in principle can transcend the circumstances of their birth. And who knows, maybe they will. There's hope for us. Hopefully there's hope for us. And then towards the end of the book, he speaks, he has a whole section, we're talking about the truth of Buddhism, and why Buddhism is true. His last section is secular Buddhism a religion? So in other words, if you live this way, just on its own terms, is that actually a religion? Now my own approach to these things is talking about faith or religion, the broadest possible definition. To use Paul Tillich's term, whatever your ultimate concern is. Everybody has an ultimate concern, so whatever that is, that's your religion and that's your faith. I don't care whether you call it religious or spiritual even. So, but he takes it, he uses as his inspiration William James, The Varieties of Religious Experience. Very underappreciated work by Henry James' brother, or cousin, I forget. And he in the 19th century, in an Anglo-Saxon, practical approach to life, wrote a whole book on religious experience, the varieties of religious experience, which is quite remarkable. So he says, religion can be thought of as the belief that there is an unseen order and that our supreme good lies in harmoniously adjusting ourselves thereto, which is what we're talking about here. There's an unseen order you can discover when you wake up and take the red pill, and we need to adjust ourselves thereto. And it's an ultimate order, and there are ultimate values. And he does go into those ultimate values, There's a metaphysical order, the emptiness, the interconnectedness, the oneness of everything. And there's a moral order that comes from that. He says, well, how do we react to one another then? You're not going to create wars. We're going to treat one another with compassion because it's us. It's all one. And the third kind is happiness. We're going to get happiness out of it. Wow, what a nice bonus. Because that's what we're made for. So that's what happiness is living the way we're made to be, we're made to live. So beyond the getting our genes passed on to what evolution is really aiming for at its deepest and highest level. And remember, it's a continuity there. It's a continuum. And I do want to share this. As I say, he can be really, really very eloquent and pithy, and his presentation of what Dharma is in this little paragraph is perfect. If you want to know what Dharma is, we say, Dharmas are boundless, I vow to perceive them. We say that every night So what are we talking about, Dharma? The ancient word is most commonly defined as the Buddha's teaching. That's accurate insofar as it goes, but the word also refers to the core truths that are being conveyed by the Buddha's teaching. Dharma thus denotes the reality that lies beyond our delusions, and for that matter, the reality about how those delusions give rise to suffering. And it denotes the implications of all this for our conduct. In other words, the Dharma is at once the truth about the way things are, and the truth about how it makes sense to behave in light of the way things are. It is both descriptive and prescriptive. It is the truth and the way. Perfect. Exactly. And because the Buddha's prescription is a prescription not just about liberation from suffering, but for right conduct, the word Dharma's denotations include a specifically moral one. So, Dharma can be thought of as natural law, both in the sense of the law that the physical universe complies with, and the moral law that we strive to comply with. Well, you couldn't say it better than that. And his final section is on truth and beauty. He says, of course he quotes John Keats, beauty is truth and truth is beauty. But he says when he was in meditation, on a sesshin once, it was a wintry sunset and he was outside, he was feeling kind of melancholy, but he looked at his melancholy and just stood apart from it, and it dissipated as it so often does, and then suddenly, the sunset. Wow. So he says when you get to the truth and you get rid of all the other stuff, then there's beauty there. Wow. We're stunningly beautiful. So it had gone from being a reflection of sadness to being a source of delight and even awe. So it's kind of a bonus there when you realize, well, everything is beautiful. Wow, when you really see it. And he concludes the last paragraph. There's a lot to dislike about the world we're born into. It's a world in which, as the Buddha noted, our natural way of seeing and of being lead us to suffer and to inflict suffering on others. It's a world that, as we know now, was bound to be that way, given that life on this planet was created by natural selection. Still, it may also be a world in which metaphysical truth, moral truth, and happiness can align. And a world that, as you start to realize that alignment, appears more and more beautiful. If so, this hidden order, an order that seems to lie at a level deeper than natural selection itself, is something to marvel at, and it's something I'm increasingly thankful for. So we should be too. So I recommend the book. I think you'll enjoy it and learn something in the process. So let's chant about the Dharma.